What if I told you that for hundreds of years Europeans and even Americans were chained, beaten and sold in the slave markets of North Africa? That children were torn from their families, men were forced to row galleys until their bodies collapsed, and women were dragged into harems while their homelands often turned a blind eye? When we hear the word slavery, most think only of the transatlantic trade, where millions of Africans were carried in chains to the New World. But there is another chapter, one almost buried under dust and silence, the forgotten story of the white slave trade. And this is not just ancient history. It shaped early America, tested the courage of a young nation, and forged the legend of the U.S. Marines. Slavery is as old as civilization itself. Long before the rise of the Atlantic trade, human bondage was practiced by Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Africans alike. The Mediterranean, in particular, was a theater where ships, villages, and whole coastlines lived in constant terror. For centuries, pirates from North Africa, the Barbary Coast, launched raids into southern Europe, capturing farmers in their fields, fishermen in their boats, and travelers on the roads. From Italy to Spain, from Ireland to even distant Iceland, Christian men and women disappeared, never to see their families again. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, as many as 1 million white Europeans were enslaved in North Africa. This was no minor side story, it was an industry. Captured men were forced into hard labor, rowing endless hours in galleys, quarrying stone or working fields under the burning sun. Women were pushed into domestic slavery or into the harems of wealthy rulers. The cries of those captives rarely reached the ears of their homelands, and if they did, they were often ignored, because freeing them meant paying enormous ransoms. The centers of this trade were the so-called Barbary states, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, territories along the North African coast nominally under Ottoman influence. Their rulers encouraged piracy as a source of wealth, and their fleets scoured the Mediterranean, growing bolder with every success. They justified enslavement through Islamic law, which allowed the capture of non-Muslims in war. But for the pirates, faith was only part of the story. Gold was the real motive. European powers paid tribute, massive sums of money, to avoid raids on their shipping. But this protection money was unreliable. Pirates often broke agreements whenever greed demanded. For a long time, it seemed unstoppable. And then a new player arrived on the world stage, the United States of America. In the early 1800s, America was young, fragile, and deeply divided. Thomas Jefferson had just taken office as the nation's third president. He dreamed of expanding the republic, spreading liberty, and reducing the national debt. The last thing he wanted was a foreign war. But the Barbary states had other plans. American merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean became targets. Crews were captured, cargo stolen, and prisoners thrown into dungeons in Algiers and Tripoli. Diplomacy failed. Jefferson knew he faced a terrible choice: continue paying endless tribute to rulers who grew more demanding every year, or take the fight to their shores. Paying tribute meant humiliation, weakness, and financial drain. But war meant risk. The U.S. Navy was small, untested, and America had never fought a conflict so far from home. Jefferson made his choice. He would fight. In 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States by cutting down the flag at the U.S. consulate. It was more than a symbolic gesture, it was a challenge. Jefferson responded by sending the U.S. Navy across the Atlantic. Frigates like the USS Constitution and the USS Philadelphia patrolled the waters, blockading Tripoli's harbors. But things went badly. The USS Philadelphia ran aground and was captured, its crew taken prisoner. Hundreds of American sailors were now enslaved in Tripoli, paraded through the streets as trophies of the Pasha's defiance. Jefferson realized that limited naval patrols were not enough. Something bolder was required. Enter William Eaton, a fiery former Army officer who had served as U.S. consul in Tunis. Eaton believed that the way to defeat Tripoli was not just through blockades, but by striking on land. His idea was audacious: march across the desert, raise an army of mercenaries, and overthrow the Pasha by supporting his exiled brother, Hamid Karamanli. It sounded insane. But Jefferson approved, and Eaton set out on one of the most daring expeditions in American history. With only 8 U.S. Marines led by Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and a ragtag force of about 500 Greek, Arab, and Berber mercenaries, Eaton began a brutal trek across 500 miles of desert. They endured scorching heat by day and freezing winds by night. Supplies ran short. Fights broke out among the mercenaries. Some deserted. But Eaton and O'Bannon pressed on, their small band driven by sheer determination. For the Marines, this was uncharted territory. They were venturing far beyond America's borders into an unknown world. Their survival depended on courage, discipline, and the hope that their gamble would succeed. On April 27, 1805, the force reached the coastal city of Derna. It was heavily defended with cannons lining its walls. Eaton and O'Bannon attacked. U.S. naval ships offshore bombarded the city while the Marines and mercenaries stormed the fortifications. Amid musket fire and sword clashes, the American flag was raised over the fortress, the first time it ever flew in victory on foreign soil. The capture of Derna shocked the Barbary states. A small group of Marines had achieved what great European powers had failed to do for centuries: defeat the pirates on land. The legend of the Marine Corps was born, immortalized in the line to the shores of Tripoli. The victory at Derna gave Jefferson leverage. Within weeks, the Pasha of Tripoli agreed to peace. American prisoners were freed, and tribute payments ended. The Barbary states still existed, and piracy would flare up again. But the myth of their invincibility was shattered. The white slave trade, once a thriving terror along the Mediterranean, began to fade as European and American navies grew stronger. By the mid-19th century, the practice was largely stamped out. But for centuries, entire villages in Europe had lived in fear, knowing that the Barbary corsairs might appear at any moment. And for the men and women who perished in chains, their stories rarely survived. Today, when the subject of slavery is raised, this chapter is rarely mentioned. Yet it reveals a vital truth. Slavery has never been bound to one race, one continent, or one era. It is a human tragedy that has taken countless forms across history. The white slave trade reminds us that liberty is fragile. It shows us why nations like America, though young and inexperienced, chose to fight far from home, because the price of submission was too high. And it tells us why, to this day, Marines honor those few who marched across the desert, raised the flag in a foreign land, and struck fear into the heart of tyrants. The story is forgotten by many, but history remembers. And now, so do you. Slavery, black or white, ancient or modern, is a reminder of humanity's darkest instincts. However, the courage to resist it is also a reminder of our brightest moments.